Hello, guys, and welcome to Tales About Cocktails, the show where we look at cocktails and their place in pop culture. Today, we're going to be looking at the old fashioned, its history, and its connection to the character of Don Draper from the show Mad Men. So, first, a little bit of history on the old fashioned. It is often referred to as the first ever cocktail, and whilst this is true, it's not the whole story. Back when this drink came into vogue, it would have simply been called a whiskey cocktail, or a rum cocktail, or a brandy cocktail, traditionally whiskey or brandy. And it purely referred to the mix of a spirit, sugar, and bitters. That was what a cocktail was. At that time, you had lots of other mixed drinks, such as flips, juleps, sours, but this was the only style of drink that could be called a cocktail. As time went on, there were improvements or changes made to the whiskey cocktail or the brandy cocktail, which added liqueurs like maraschino and usually absinthe. And these would be called improved whiskey cocktails, the most famous of which is a variation on the improved whiskey cocktail called the Sazerac. Now, this caused people who did not want these more fancy drinks that it added more flavour to the whiskey, whereas the original whiskey cocktail was a very whiskey-forward drink, whereas the others placed other modifiers onto the flavour profile. They would walk into a bar and they would ask for their drink to be made old-fashioned, and that's how the term came into vogue. Now, of course, the term cocktail refers to any kind of mixed drink, not specifically one with bitters. It's true that the old-fashioned is the first ever cocktail, but it's not the first ever mixed drink. Now, here's how to make one, which is, the most important thing to be told in any cocktail media. So the classic recipe, this is from Dave Wondrich's annotation of Jerry Thomas's bar manual called Imbibe. And he says that you need to add a bar spoon of sugar, or a sugar cube, soak it in bitters, then add some lukewarm water, stir it to get as much of the water dissolved as possible, and then add a double 50ml, or I think in America, because their doubles are bigger, 60ml, of a spirit of your choice, usually whiskey or brandy. Now, that makes a fine drink, of course, but if you want to upgrade it a bit, you would add ice, which would have came about around the late 1800s or so, when the ice trade really kicked off in America. Now, this makes the dissolving of the granulated sugar or the sugar cube much harder, so the way that it's adapted even more so in modern day is to use sugar syrups. Now, a lot of people prefer to still use granulated sugar, to use sugar cubes, because they feel like that's more historically accurate, even though the sugar that would have been used back then wasn't a sugar cube. It was something called loaf sugar that would have been picked off a big block that would have been behind the bar. But even so, people like to use sugar cubes, but also there's a kind of, not only because of the more traditional aspect in what's already a very traditional cocktail, but also there's a certain element, whereas when you start drinking it, very stiff drink, very strong, not sweet at all, but as you continue with the drink, as you spend some time with it, as you let the kind of flavours get to know each other and the sugar starts to dissolve more and more, and as you get to the end where the sugar has settled, it becomes sweeter and more approachable. And some people like that, as it kind of gives the drink some variation. It kind of allows it to almost live in the glass. Whereas, and this is the recipe I use, and this is adapted from Greg from How to Drink's recipe, is I use a bar spoon of sugar syrup. So you pre-dissolve the sugar. I use basically 2 to 1, 2 sugar to 1 water. And then I add 2 to 4 dashes of bitters, depending on my mood. Then I add a double of whatever whiskey, usually bourbon, I prefer. And then I add ice, stir it, and then add a peel of orange. Now, the Jerry Thomas version also had orange, but obviously that would have been harder to come by without refrigeration and such. But yeah, so orange has always been a part of the drink. But yeah, that makes a drink that is far more consistent. You can make it the exact same every time, especially because I make my own sugar syrup. So you know exactly how it's going to taste. There's just a lot less variations, whereas with sugar cubes, you can get some that are smaller than others, and also the amount that dissolves. So it removes a lot of the guesswork from making it. So yeah, I recommend that you make yourself one for this next bit, where we will be discussing the television show Mad Men and analysing. So, the television show Mad Men, which first aired in 2007, was created by Matthew Weiner, and it was about the death of the Mad Men era, or tracking a group of advertising agency through the 60s. Our protagonist is Don Draper, and he is presented as the almost hegemonic ideal, the ideal of hegemonic masculinity. He's played expertly by John Hamm, but all the other characters in the show kind of aspire to be him, or be with him in some form. But throughout the show, we see that he is himself a performance. The character of Don Draper that everyone is aspiring to does not actually exist. Don Draper is so interesting because he is not, in fact, he's a character in the show that we're watching, but also in the world that he inhabits. His real name is Dick Whitman. He's a farm boy from a farm, as most farm boys are, and he grew up in poverty. His mother was a prostitute who died giving birth to him, and his father was a drunk who was married to an abusive woman, and they both bullied Don. And Don saw his father die by being kicked by a horse at a very young age, and then he was raised by a prostitute in a brothel for the remainder of his childhood. Basically, he's lived in Dick, we see this kind of the American dream. From the bottom, he worked his way up to becoming Don Draper. But the thing is, he didn't do this through what the American dream posits, which is hard work, even though there was plenty of hard work involved. He goes to Korea, and his commanding officer, Don Draper, is killed in a explosion. And Dick Whitman, seeing the horrors of war, takes the dog tags from Don Draper's corpse and puts them on. He becomes Don Draper, and he's sent home. He has to take his body, the body of who now the world sees as Dick Whitman, to the family, and he stays on the bus as his half-brother chases after the train, convinced that he's seen Dick on the train. Here we see that Don Draper's / Dick Whitman's life has been mired with tragedy. He's a very complicated character, not only through who he is in the present, but his past is very mysterious and tragic. But in most shows, this would be the focal point. The idea that, the show will be based around Don Draper keeping this a secret from everyone. If you think of a show like Suits, in which the protagonist, Mike Ross, lied about getting into Harvard and never actually went to law school. That is the focal point of a majority of the show. Mad Men is quite similar in premise, but Don Draper, in an attempt to discredit Don, Pete Campbell reveals the fact that Don Draper is not who he says he is to Bert Cooper, one of the founders of the firm, in the first series. And Bert Cooper says he doesn't really care who he is as long as he keeps doing good work. That also kind of ties into the kind of Americana glorification that, in this great land, we don't need to know who you are. It doesn't matter who you were. It's all just about who you're going to be and the work you put in. But in Don, we see this kind of self-destructive cycle where trying to become this man that everyone already thinks he is, he destroys himself again and again and again. And it's a tragic show. But how then does this link to the old-fashioned? Well, it's his drink of choice, simply. From a purely surface level, the drink we see him drink most often is, aside from just straight bourbon, is an old-fashioned. He asks for it by name in many bars, and we see him drinking it, usually with clients. Now, how do we link the kind of classic old-fashioned with Don Draper? Well, Don Draper in show and seen by the audience is kind of seen as the masculine ideal, and even though I've just said that that's not true, I also said that he's aspiring to that masculine ideal. He's aspiring to be Don Draper. So of course Don Draper would drink a drink that is literally called the old-fashioned. It has a certain amount of prestige to it. Other characters in the show drink martinis or whiskey sours, which are, great drinks. And specifically, the martini is a far more European drink, whereas the old-fashioned is purely American. But there's a kind of aspirational quality to Don Draper's choice of drink. He is drinking an old-fashioned not only because it's something that he enjoys, but also because it is something that he feels like he should enjoy. I think we've all experienced something similar in life, like the first time you take a sip of beer and you don't like it, but you think, oh, well, as a guy, I need to be able to drink beer, and so you drink it again and again until you get used to the taste, and then in some cases, like in my case, you actually start to like it. I think the same thing happened when I was a kid with tea. I tried tea and I was like, oh, it's not that great, but then my mum would drink it every day, and she'd make me a cup, and I'd drink it, and over time, the taste became comforting. It became something that I liked. And I think the old-fashioned to Don is a very similar kind of thing. He finds solace in it, not only purely because of the alcohol, but because it kind of represents what he wants to be. The ideal American man. But the whole show kind of deconstructs the idea of the American man and how it can't exist in a world that is changing in a way that it needs to change. Throughout the show, we see the characters react to the civil rights movement, the death of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, the death of Marilyn Monroe, the death of Kennedy. We see them react to the moon landing. We see them react to the Vietnam War. We see them react to Beatlemania and Woodstock. And we see these characters kind of look shocked as this world changes more than they've ever seen it change before. The 60s to America was such an important time because everything was changing. Love was changing, sex was changing, the perception of race and, to an extent, gender was changing. So much was fought for in that decade, and in Mad Men we meet occasionally people who are fighting that fight, but primarily we view it as outsiders. We view it from the privileged majority, well, the privileged position. We see it from Don Draper or Roger's view of the kind of aloof Madison Square Gardens upper-class white men looking down from their windows at the carnage below. There's a scene during a civil rights march where someone in the same building as the offices, Don Draper's offices, throws a bag of water, or I think it's urine, outside the window at civil rights protesters. There it's drawing a clear differentiating line between the people literally in the ivory tower and the people down on the ground fighting for change. And we do see overlap. We have certain instances where characters that Don comes into contact with force him to confront certain aspects of his own privilege or racism or sexism. For example, the character of Peggy Olson in Series 1, she becomes almost like a protege figure to Don, and in the end of the show almost becomes a Don 2.0. She has the same pitfalls, but there is hope that she might become better. But she also forces Don to confront the sexism in his own workplace. In the first episode, he gets into a fight with Pete Campbell about the way Pete Campbell's talking to her, and he says, you can't talk to a woman like that. Of course, this doesn't come from any kind of feminist sentiment. He's just, from his perspective, women are meant to be protected, and in this instance, he's seeing someone being rude, and so he combats it. But that doesn't stop the hypocrisy, is that doesn't stop him from being equally, if not more so, verbally or abusive to his own wife. And later, we see him tackle the idea of race with the character of Dawn, who becomes his secretary in, I think, Series 4 and onwards. They are forced to hire her, after a joke. Basically, they find out that a rival ad agency has done something racist, and so Roger Sterling jokingly and juvenilely puts in the paper an advert that they're hiring black people. And they don't expect anyone to take it seriously, but then one day they come into the office, and it's full of people awaiting an interview. And they realise, well, they've got to hire someone, so they hire Dawn. But what Dawn does, just by being there and doing her job, is she forces all of them to kind of confront their own prejudices. Now, Dawn is never shown to be an overtly racist character. In fact, the first time we see him, he is nonchalantly talking to a black character about his choice of cigarettes, because he's working on a Lucky Strike pitch. And then the waiter comes over and tries to kind of, in Don's aid, and Don makes it very clear that he's quite comfortable talking to this man. We see Don isn't wholly outdated by the beginning of the show, in the same way that Roger or some other characters are. It's more of a gradual being left behind. It gets to a certain point in the show where he's reached the amount he can change or grow. The tolerance level, in a way, has been reached. And I see that very similarly. The old-fashioned, as you can tell from the earlier recipes, in the almost 200 years it's been around, it's not changed, aside from pre-dissolved sugar and ice, which have been a staple for at least over 80% of the time the cocktail's been around anyway. The cocktail, in its intrinsic form, the old-fashioned, has not changed. It might have moments where you think it might do. For example, in the 60s, the old-fashioned became a weird drink with orange juice and cherries, and it became something very strange and twisted, but it always reverts back to that same basic form. And in that same way, so does Don. In that same way, so does the show. Throughout all of its change, the ending of Mad Men is startlingly similar to the beginning. We have characters in different situations, and there is a implication that progress has happened and progress will continue to happen, and things are improving. But even though there are different characters, the key positions are still the same. Peggy's Don. Joan is something similar to Roger. And it's just, there's no real change. There's no change to the status quo. The only difference is that the male characters, Don, Roger, and Bert, and Pete, find themselves in different situations. I think that's all we're going to have time for today, discussing the old-fashioned and its relation to Don Draper, but I hope you've enjoyed it. In the future, I plan on doing more deep dives into different shows, but also looking at different characters' drinks in the show Mad Men. I also intend to look at different cocktails and provide different histories as time goes on. Put in the comments below what you think about, if you agree with my analysis, if you have analysis of your own. Why do you think Don Draper drinks the old fashions? Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.